Hello there. My name is Professor Rich, and we're going to learn about learning languages. I'm a professional English teacher. I've been teaching English for 16 years now. I started teaching in 2008. I've studied quite a lot myself during that time, including currently I'm doing a master's. This is the second time that I've studied a master's. And I want to talk to you today about something very interesting that I've discovered while studying this master's. Master's studies can be a great way of updating your knowledge, even better than doing a training course sometimes, because even training courses can be a little bit out of date. But when you study a master's, and particularly a master's with a research element, then you can discover some very interesting things, kind of really get up to date with what's going on in your area. And I'm going to talk about one of those things today because, of course, our topic for the day is a new language learning model. And you can see a bit of a contrast there between the traditional behaviorism, which we will talk about, and something else, which we'll talk about also today. May I take a moment just to say hello to everybody in the chat. So, hello to Sylvia, who is the second ever paying member of the channel, and she is paying at the highest tier. So that is a lot of support for the channel, Sylvia. That is very motivational for me to do these streams, that people are joining the membership. The membership only opened last month. So if you do wish to contribute to the channel, joining the membership is a great way to do that. And you can see the button on YouTube to do that. So thank you for Sylvia, who will forever be known as the first person to join the highest tier of membership on the channel. Thank you very much. And hello to Sleepwalker. Hello to Julia. So let's start with a bit of background on language learning. Let's start with a bit of background. Now, for this, we go back to the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. So this is some time ago, right? We're going back to the 1940s, actually to the early 1960s. And we're going to talk about behaviorism, just a little bit. Most people probably know a bit about behaviorism. I'm sure you've heard at some point the term behaviorism. In the model of behaviorism, which is often associated with a guy called Skinner, or B.F. Skinner, he's the famous behaviorist. So according to behaviorism, learning is essentially habits and positive reinforcement. So what that means is you do something, and if you do it in the right way, you get a reward, some reward. Then you do it again, and you get a reward. You do it again, you get a reward. And over time, this results in acquisition, which means you have learned that thing. So it's all about this repetition with positive reinforcement, okay? And behaviorism has been widely studied in animals and humans. So we see it in humans and animals, the same sort of thing, especially so in animals. There's a very famous, there's a lot of very famous experiments, particularly involving rats in the maze, little rats in the maze, right? But there's also Pavlov's dog, you might hear of, where they train this dog that when the bell rings, ding, 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 then it's time to eat. And if you do this enough times, you ring the bell, ding, 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 and the dog starts to salivate. That is, salivate means his mouth gets wet because he wants food. And he starts to do that even if there's no food. He does it just from the bell. So this is this kind of idea of behaviorism. Now, in the 1950s and early 1960s, behaviorism was also the paradigm of language learning. And paradigm means like the main example idea of language learning. So according to behaviorism in the 1950s and 60s, this is also how you learn a language, right? So behaviorism would be like, you say something, like you say, I not go to France, right? This is the student. And the teacher says, ... unhappy face. And the student says, I didn't go to France. Right? And then the teacher goes, like that. Okay? Oh, you can't see it. Sorry about that. Let me just move myself a little bit. What can I do here? We can move over here. Okay? So then the student says, I not go to France. The teacher, not happy. The student, I didn't go to France. And the teacher goes, yeah, great, well done. Right? And then we do that. We have many instances of that. And eventually the student learns, I didn't go to France. Okay, so that's basically that's the very, very simple version of behaviorism. And this is our negative feedback, is the unhappy face, and the happy face is what I called reinforcement. Reinforcement, or positive reinforcement. The student gets it right, and the teacher goes, yeah, great, well done, fantastic. And we do that again and again and again, and you build up these habits, and your language comes alive. And hello to other people joining us today. Hello, 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 hello. So, behaviorism, however, has some problems. Because if this is true, we cannot really explain language. Because people actually start to learn things about language which they don't get this practice with. So this practice of you try it, positive feedback, and again and again and again, you don't actually get that practice with all of the things that you know about language. In other words, there are things that you know about English now which you did not practice like that. And you can use them and they're correct. So you have things you can use and you know in English, and you use them well and naturally, and they're part of your language, but you didn't do that. So how did you learn them? Right? Well, behaviorism, especially the early behaviorism in the 1960s, does not have an answer for that. Behaviorism cannot explain those things. And this we call poverty of stimulus. Poverty of stimulus. So poverty means a lack. Can I put this here? Poverty of stimulus. Thank you for the autocorrect. So a lack of stimulus. In other words, you don't have to practice all of the things you know, and you don't even necessarily hear or see all the things you know. In fact, there are things that you know about English which maybe you've never actually seen, but you know it. Right? And we know this because there's lots of very complicated studies which have been done which show that both native learners and non-native learners know things about their language which they don't have evidence for. They just know it. So there's a problem. And this problem is poverty of stimulus, lack of input, lack of evidence. How do you know these things? You haven't actually seen them. You haven't actually practiced them. Doesn't make sense. So behaviorism has a problem. And this problem was answered. This problem was answered in the 1960s. Are there any clever people in chat who know how this problem was answered? What was the response by the academic community? Does anybody know? We have this problem with behaviorism. People seem to know things which they have no evidence for. So how do they know this stuff about languages when they haven't actually experienced it, but they do know it? They have learned it. It seems like magic. What was the answer from the academic community? Any ideas, anyone? And by the way, hello to Pachu. Good to see you. You got 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And by the way, if you are watching this video on YouTube later, it's a great time to smash that like button and definitely hit subscribe. Subscribing in particular is very important to the YouTube algorithm, so do go ahead and do that. Okay, so no ideas. Well, the answer is something called universal grammar. Has anyone heard of this? This is universal grammar. This came about in the late 1960s. So, universal grammar is often associated with Noam Chomsky, a linguist called Noam Chomsky. He's still alive. And universal grammar reflected a change in how languages were viewed. So in behaviorism, we think languages are all about habits and repetition. But with universal grammar, that changes and it becomes language is all about rules. Language is all about rules. And basically, what Chomsky said was he said, we are born with a rule system or a rule structure which is specific for languages. When we learn a language, we set parameters within that structure, and this creates a rule set. We call this rule set what do we call this rule set? That's not universal grammar, is it? It's the grammar. We don't call the rule set anything. Okay. So this structure, this rule structure, which we are born with, according to Chomsky, he says we're born with this. We have this special structure just for languages. We're born with it, and that's called universal grammar. When we learn a language, we set parameters within that structure, And that creates a specific rule set which can generate any sentence, any valid, any correct sentence in the language. Now, what is a parameter, and what example can I give of a parameter? So, a common parameter that people talk about, let me just make another page for universal grammar. I need another page for it. Okay. A common parameter that people talk about is they call it null subject parameter. So when we consider the null subject parameter, we can compare, for example, English and Spanish. So with English does not have a null subject. So the null subject parameter says you must have a subject in English, right? So we say, for example, in English, we say, it's raining. Or we say, there is a car. Okay? And if you look at these sentences, you see here is the main verb in both sentences. And here is the object or the complement in both sentences. But what about the subject? Oh, well, here's the subject. We have the subject it, and we have the subject there. But what does that mean? It's raining. What's it? There is a car. What's there? What do you mean there is a car? Right? That's a bit strange, isn't it? So in English, we call that a dummy subject, and we need that. Because English does not have the null subject parameter. However, Spanish does. So in Spanish, you can say, hay lluvia. Why am I spelling it like that? Hay lluvia, right? Now that's the verb, I, right? So let's color that like the verb, blue. And then there's the complement. There's no subject. There's no subject, right? Or we could just say, llueve, right? Which means it's raining, but there's no subject. So Spanish has this null subject parameter, which means at some point, if you learn Spanish, your universal grammar in your head for the language of Spanish will set that parameter to say, in Spanish, there is a null subject, which means we don't need a subject as a specific word when we're speaking. However, when you learn English in your universal grammar for that rule set, your mind will set the parameter to say, there is no null subject in English, which means we need a subject. It is required. Okay. So this is how universal grammar works theoretically. We can also talk about other things like the position of the subject. Like, is it subject, verb, object? Or is it verb, subject, object? Right? Different positions. So we could talk about this kind of parameter. For example, go me with you, right? Some languages, they speak like that. Go me with you. Take pen to table, right? take pen, me to the table, right? You can say things like that in other languages. So there's parameters like that. Now, the actual specific parameters and so on, you know, people argue about those. They're trying to discover them and so on. But the point about universal grammar is, for years and years and years and years, since the 1960s, universal grammar has dominated language learning. So many, many language learning theories come from universal grammar. We have, for example, Stephen Krashen and the input hypothesis, the idea that languages are learned by listening to comprehensible input. And while you're doing that, your mind is setting those universal grammar parameters, and then you go out and use the language, and you get positive. Your mind is calibrating all the time these parameters through interaction and input. So with universal grammar, we very much have this idea of languages are kind of learned by themselves, and it's not really about studying, right? It's kind of like you're just going out there, and these, whatever you can do to make your mind set these parameters for that language, that's what you need to do. So we have things like communicative language teaching, community language learning, and so on and so on. Now, there's a question that I had about universal grammar. Actually, many questions. One of them, which is quite important, is exactly what are the parameters? And how do I set them? How do you actually set a parameter in your internal rule set for universal grammar? I mean, let's say I want to teach you a new language. I can tell you about the parameter. Like, imagine we have an English speaker and we want to teach them Spanish. So we say, oh, in Spanish, you don't need the subject. In Spanish, you don't need the subject, right? We just say that. Does that mean that they will never make the mistake of not using a subject? No, of course not. It's not enough. You can't just tell them. That doesn't work. Knowing the rules of the language does not set your universal grammar parameter. So then the question is, well, how do you set it? And actually, no one has a good answer for that. It's kind of like, oh, you listen and you practice and you study and you spend time with the language and you, I don't know, what do you do next? You dance outside, stand on one leg and sacrifice a small animal. You know, I don't know. Right? It's kind of a mystery. It's like, it's a bit too magical. How do we set these universal grammar parameters? And for many, basically until now, no one has an answer to that. And so the problem, the real big problem with universal grammar is the implications for teaching are not very clear. In other words, universal grammar, okay, cool. So what? So what? What does that mean? How does that help me teach? How does it help you learn? And that's been a big problem for a long time. And recently, something's happened. So, a few decades ago, we started to get devices which can scan the brain. These are things like CT scans and MRI scanners, and also certain electro scanners for the brain. And neuroscientists have been very excited about these devices. They've used them to study all kinds of things. about how our minds work in certain situations. And for years, neuroscientists have been studying, just working out what happens in the brain and when, and trying to work out, oh, the front of the brain does this, and the back of the brain does that, and the middle of the brain does this, right? So they've been doing that with these devices. Linguists, okay, yeah, the neuroscientists doing their thing, whatever. Then this guy comes along called Michael Ullman. And he caused a bit of a storm. Let's have his name here. So Michael Ullman is a neuroscientist. And he knows quite a lot about the memory learning systems of the brain. He's been studying them for some time, mainly in, just things like learning sports or memorizing events, memorizing facts, But then he came along and started to apply this to language learning. And he found that basically the theories and hypotheses which seemed to be correct in other areas also applied to language. And this is really important for a number of reasons. We'll come back to that. First of all, let's talk about exactly what the system is we're talking about. So, there are two systems relevant to this theory in the mind. Two systems, and they are called the declarative system or declarative memory and procedural memory. And they are in different parts of the brain. So they are physically located in different parts of the brain. And we know certain things about them. We know, for example, declarative is conscious and semantic. Semantic means meaningful. So anything or most things which are conscious and meaningful, they are stored in a part of the brain which we can call the declarative memory system. It's in the hippocampus, if you know about the structure of the brain. The other one, the procedural, is unconscious. So we have no conscious access to procedural memory, although it does have an effect and it does learn. It's unconscious and relates to patterns and motor skills. Patterns and motor skills. Now, when you see patterns, what do you think there? Patterns, that's like rule sets, isn't it? Patterns, that's what patterns are. Patterns are like rules. Or like applied, when you apply a rule, you get a pattern. So that's interesting, isn't it? But it's unconscious, which means we can't actually realize procedural memory, but it is there. Factually, we know it's there. We have the evidence scientifically. Okay. So going back to our linguists and our universal grammar, why is this a big problem for them? Well, UG, Universal Grammar, said we have a language-specific structure. But DP model, declarative procedural, says We don't need a specific structure. And it appears languages use these general systems. So the declarative procedural model is saying there's nothing special about language. It's in terms of our brain, there's nothing special about language. Our brain has these systems and we can use them to understand and produce language. But we don't actually have a special, dedicated system that's just for language. And that's the end for universal grammar. Because if there is no special underlying magical universal grammar system, then we can just throw out universal grammar. So that's the end of like 70 years of academic research. People spent their whole lives on universal grammar, and this theory has come along and said, yeah, you've just invented that. It might be useful in some ways, and it might seem to reflect reality, but it's not real. It's not true. So obviously the linguists, they don't like that. Well, a lot of them. A lot of them are quite upset. I can think of some in particular whose papers I've read, but I'm not going to talk about it. Instead, I want to talk about this declarative procedural memory, and then we're going to talk about what that means. What does it mean for me as a teacher? What does it mean for you as a student? So let's talk about this declarative procedural model, the DP model. So we're going to start with procedural. I thought we'd start with declarative, actually, but okay, we'll start with procedural. So as I said, it's unconscious and pattern-based or motor skills, right? Motor skills means movement. Like if you're learning to dance, it's procedural memory. If you're learning to do boxing, that's procedural memory. Right? If you're learning to play the piano, that's primarily procedural memory. It's unconscious, pattern-based motor skills. All right? Now, studying and memorizing does not build procedural memory. Studying and memorizing is a conscious process. But studying and memorizing, especially in terms of facts, it doesn't build procedural memory. Procedural memory requires practice. Procedural memory is slow to progress, and it needs feedback. So practice, feedback, and it's slow, right? Imagine playing the piano. How long does it take to learn to play the piano? It takes a long time, right? I mean, compare learning learning about European history in the 1940s versus learning to play the piano. And how many years would it take to learn history in Europe in the 1940s versus to play the piano? How long does it take to become very good, not great, but very good at playing piano? How long does it take to become very good at history in Europe in the 1940s? So we can see that procedural memory seems slower, and it is. That's proven. It's slow, it needs practice, and it needs feedback. We need feedback. We need the positive reinforcement, okay, for procedural memory. So the procedural memory recognizes rules and patterns, but complex rules take much longer to recognize. So a simple rule, right? Let's say you have a rat in a maze, and every time the rat turns left, something good happens after 5 seconds. So the rat turns left, 5 seconds, something good happens. The rat turns left, 5 seconds, something good happens, right? If you do that, the rat will acquire procedurally the habit of turning left. And by the way, the rat won't know that they're doing this yet. So it won't be a conscious thing. It's still unconscious. It doesn't become conscious until you, oh, I'm doing that, right? Then it's conscious. But the procedural unconscious part happens before that. And they have studied that, and it's true. Okay? So simple rule, yeah, you're going to get that quite quickly. But what if it's a really complex rule? What if the rule is you turn left 5 times and then right twice and then left once? And every time you do that, you get a big reward. Left 5, right twice, left 1 in the maze. So left, 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 right, right, left. And then you get a reward. How long will that take for your procedural memory? Quite a long time, probably. And what also if you do it and it's not that you definitely get a reward, instead, you just might get a reward. So maybe 50% chance of reward. So 5 times left, twice right, once left, and then 50% chance of reward. How long would it take for you to develop the habit of doing left, 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 right, right, left? And I don't mean conscious, I mean unconscious. That's your habit. Probably that would take a very long time. And the thing is, languages are a bit like that. And so we can kind of understand, we can kind of see why becoming like a native takes such a long amount of time. Because we have this procedural memory system that requires a long time to get these rules in. And it does need that positive feedback. If you're having negative experiences, negative feedback, or you just don't recognize the positive feedback, then that's not going to help very much. So you need that positive feedback. It's important, critical for your procedural memory. That's been studied. All right. So let's move on to declarative. Oh, by the way, one more thing about procedural: motor skills, therefore pronunciation. Let's move on to declarative. So declarative is conscious, requires effort. It's conscious, requires effort, and semantic, which means meaning. Semantic, meaning, right? So anything to do with meaning, right, is declarative. So what color is this pen? The color is pink. What does pink mean? What is pink? Well, pink is this color, right? So that is declarative memory in action. And that's meaning, it's semantic. And in fact, all lexical knowledge is semantic. Or all lexical knowledge regards meaning is semantic, right? Of course, semantic. We know it's semantic. Declarative. So this part of our mind, the conscious part, stores everything about what words mean. And of course, you can't learn a language without knowing what words mean, can you? If I say pink in English, you need to know that pink is this color. That's meaning. That's important. Of course, you need that for languages. So all lexical knowledge is declarative. That means we have to learn vocabulary consciously. This blew my mind. I've been teaching for a long time, thinking that people will learn meaning of lexical items without needing to consciously think about it. But that's not true. What they can do is they can develop procedural habits which help them to guess the meaning. That's true. But what they can't do is they can't magically, without consciously thinking about it, understand the meaning of a new word. It requires conscious thought. It doesn't happen magically. So lexical knowledge is conscious. So we really need to know that. And we need to know that actually I need to consciously learn vocabulary. Maybe not grammar, but vocabulary, yes. So, conscious, effortful, lexical knowledge. The other thing about declarative is the declarative system can both learn and apply grammar, but it's slow. So my procedural system and my declarative system can both learn and apply the same grammar rule. But the declarative system is conscious, requires effort, and it's slow. And by the way, the memory systems do not transfer. They do have an effect on each other, but knowledge does not transfer from one to the other. So, this has an important implication because this means we can learn grammar rules and we can apply them. And it looks like we know the rule. However, if we're using the declarative system to apply the rule, we don't really know it because it's not in our procedural memory. That's where we need it. And when you look at the brains of native speakers, you see that they are far more procedural than non-natives. And when you look at non-native learners of a language who are at beginning level and advanced level, you see at the advanced level, they use a higher proportion of procedural memory. So procedural memory, using procedural memory for languages is very desirable. We want that. We want that procedural memory. But remember, we can't consciously do anything about that. We can't consciously interact with procedural memory. All we can do is put ourselves in a good situation, practice habitually, and receive positive feedback. That's what we can do. Okay. So when it comes to grammar, we can use the declarative system like a support. Okay. It's like if your legs aren't working, you can use crutches, right? the declarative system is like the crutches. Crutches, you walk when you have broken legs, right? You walk with the crutches. So we could use crutches. Crutches take effort and they're slow. But if you need to move, then crutches, okay. But we really want to walk, right? That's our aim. Our objective in this analogy is to walk. And walking means procedural, unconscious habit. Okay? So that's a really important implication, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So it's important to note that the declarative system also operates in the realm of metacognition. That means thinking about thinking. So if you are consciously applying a strategy to your language interaction or language learning, then that's also coming from declarative. So even though we might not be too keen on declarative grammar, we can see that the declarative system has a lot of advantages as well, because metacognition is really important. Thinking about thinking, you know, like let's say, for example, let's say that you are Italian, you're learning English, and you've moved to London, and you're going to the shops for the first time, and you think, hey, before I go to the shop, I'm just going to think a bit about the vocabulary that I'll need in the shop. That's metacognition. It's a meta strategy. And you're using declarative memory in order to think and apply that strategy. So obviously declarative is important in many ways because those strategies are really important to being a successful language learner. And that's for sure. Is there anything else we need to say about declarative? It's conscious, requires effort, semantic, lexical knowledge. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. So let's talk about implications. So we'll talk about the implications, and basically we're going to think here, oh, hello, Super Besley. I don't know how to say your name, but this chap was the first ever paying member of the channel. So it is a pleasure to have you here, buddy, and thank you very much for your support. Let's talk about the implications of this, the declarative and procedural systems. So on the one hand, we have study, which is explicit, and we could also say conscious. And then we have our habit style learning, which is implicit. It's based on practice, and it's procedural. And what we want to do is we want to decide when do we do one and when do we do the other. And this is exactly the topic which I've just studied. Let's just call it habit learning. Okay. So for study, vocabulary meaning. There is no doubt vocabulary meaning must be conscious, effortful, and you need to study it. That's for sure. Meta strategies and autonomous learner strategies. And this simply means learning ways that you can help yourself learn. So learning ways to learn better. That's all that means, right? When I say meta strategies and autonomous learner strategies, it just means learning ways to learn better without a teacher, by the way. This means you on your own in the world, and you learn these strategies to help you learn better. So that is something worth studying. It's worth consciously studying and memorizing and applying using your declarative memory. All right, meta strategies. And next, we have grammar support. So the idea of learning explicit grammar rules can support you like crutches. Just remember that in order to come off the crutches, you need to let go of the crutches. So if you always rely on this declarative thinking through the process consciously, it can actually block your procedural acquisition. And they've studied that, and it seems to be true. So that's quite important to realize. Could you be someone who thinks too much about your grammar consciously when you speak? And that might actually be stopping your acquisition. That's a massive implication. All right, so what else do we have? Vocabulary, meta strategies, grammar support. I think that's the main ones. Right, we move on to procedural. So, ideally, grammar is learned unconsciously through use and feedback. So basically, when you're learning the rules, grammar rules, ideally you want those rules to be learned unconsciously through use and feedback. However, we should know simple rules are easy for this system to acquire, but advanced rules take much longer. So we might also say about grammar support, we might say, these are particularly useful for advanced rules, which will take much longer to acquire procedurally. So we could say that. The other thing to say about procedural is that motor skills are procedural, and therefore pronunciation, mouth movement, etc. is procedural. So practice pronunciation a lot and do it in a way that you get positive feedback. Do it in a way that you get positive feedback. I think these implications are so important. I never knew this. When I learned Spanish, I used to just practice pronunciation without positive feedback. I just did it on my own. I mean, the only positive feedback I have is I can hear the sound and I can think, is that the right right? But that's not great, is it? It's not brilliant. It's not ideal. Not really fantastic positive feedback. And I think this bit about simple rules are easier to acquire is really important as well. It's really important. There's something else we should say. The older you are, the slower your procedural acquisition is. So in other words, if you're older, you need to use the declarative system more. There's no option. Well, there is an option. You still have procedural memory. We can still learn habits when we're older, of course. But it's just worth noting that the older you are, the more you need to lean into declarative as a support system. It's unfortunate because declarative for grammar is slow and takes effort, but we need to lean into it more. 6-year-olds are very, very good at habit learning, unconscious procedural memory. But older people, it gets more difficult. We know that. No, that's not the case, Sylvia. Everyone has procedural memory, okay? Imagine this, Sylvia. Just imagine this, okay? I don't know if you know how to fly a helicopter. Do you know how to fly a helicopter, Sylvia? Now let's imagine I'm going to teach you how to fly a helicopter. And mainly, I want to teach you how to use the control, right? And I want to teach you the feeling of the control and how that changes the helicopter. Now imagine that. Could you learn that? Because if the answer is yes, then you have procedural memory. Because that is this, using the control of a helicopter, that's procedural. Like we say things like getting the feel. You know, like how to drive. How to drive is procedural. You start the car and you do the pedal and you do this. That's procedural. It's procedural memory. Playing piano, playing guitar, things like that. So, you know, if you could learn those procedural skills, or a new dance is another one. Do you cha-cha-cha? Cha-cha-cha. Cha-cha-cha. Right? If you learn a new dance, that's procedural. It's procedural memory there. So it's there. We just need to take into account that maybe we need a bit more declarative support as we get older. That's all. That's okay. I definitely don't want to say anything that declarative is bad. We just need to acknowledge procedural is desirable, but sometimes we do need this grammar support in the declarative. But this is also more relevant as you're older. So I would actually argue from this that maybe with like 10-year-olds, we shouldn't teach them grammar. Not unless they're very advanced and they need to learn the, they need to learn like a mixed conditional with ellipsis or something, or cleft sentences or, complex participle clauses in the past. If they're learning something very complex, which is going to take a long time to acquire procedurally, and they're young, then okay. But I think most of the time, I don't think we should be teaching rules to young children. Don't think they need it for grammar. Conscious rules. And if we do teach them, it should be at the end of the class, like an afterthought. Definitely not at the start. We don't want to teach them the rule before they use it, actually. We want the other way. Use it, use it, use it. Feedback, feedback, feedback. And then tell them what they're doing after. That's it. So anyway, that brings us to the end of the class today. I hope that's been super interesting for you. That was a class basically on the DP model by Michael Ullman. And if you Google him, you can read more about that. We're now going to go into questions and answers. And I will do my best to answer any questions that you have about language learning or about anything in general. If you want to download the notes from today's class, you can. Just give me a moment. Anyone with a link, copy link, done, and then make it into a short link. Last time I tried to do this last week, it didn't work very well, but let's try it again. We're going to just create a link, go here, custom back half, DP model, and create my link. Great. So if you want to download the notes from today, you can. The link is there on your screen. And in just a moment, we'll be down below the video. I just noticed stream numbers are horrible today. I wasn't looking before. It's funny because when I did the vote, people were super interested in this topic, but turns out it was incredibly unpopular for one reason or another. Don't know. Did I stream at the wrong time? Anyway, any questions, folks? How can I help you? How can I help you? This is the doctor is in the office. Doctor's in the office, and make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Can I just take a moment? I'm just going to take a moment and heat my coffee, okay? I'll be back in a second. Right, everybody, just give me a second. I'm coming right back. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Right. Okay, let's see what we got. Can we discuss British dining etiquette next time? Urquhart, it was really unpopular in the vote. I don't know why. I mean, I wouldn't mind doing a lesson on it. I'll tell you what, I'll think about it. By the way, I don't actually know if I'm going to stream next week because we're getting really close to Christmas. So I don't particularly know what's going to happen with that. But we'll see. Okay, thanks for the question anyway. We'll see. There definitely are people who are interested in it, and there's people on the Discord who've posted about it as well. So we'll see. Do we need to speak fast at the expense of correctness? I've heard that some native speakers might be impatient with slower speed. That's a really interesting question, Anawat, and I think there's a number of things that we can say about it. So, first of all, I think that fluency is king, actually. So, as long as you're expressing yourself in a way that's correct, no, not correct, sorry. As long as you're expressing yourself in a way which means someone can understand you. So, we say that you're communicating meaningfully, that your communication is successful. As long as you're doing that, that is the most important thing. Fluency is king. I know that for exams and, you know, for our own self-image and so on, we want to be correct, but the reality is that fluency is king. So if someone says, you know, do you want a cup of coffee? And you say, yes, please, it good, I like, right? Whereas someone else says, that, then I think if we ask the question, which of those is better, is it better to... I didn't realise my screen was like that. Has it been like that the whole class? Oh, no, it hasn't. It's just now, isn't it? Okay, let's do that. This is actually better. Because, yeah, you're right, that people are impatient. It's not that native speakers are impatient. It's that people are impatient. People want to communicate. So it's absolutely true that in the real world, it's just better to just express yourself how you need to express yourself. And also take heart that doing this, you will acquire procedural grammar. We know that now. Because when you do this and you say it wrong, the person will be like, okay. And you'll start to notice when you say things wrong and when you say them right. And you can notice unconsciously. You don't even need to do it consciously. And you will acquire the correct procedural grammar. So we know that now, right? So this is definitely the answer. This is definitely the answer. And it's so wild because it completely inverts what I used to think. I used to think that the point was you guess with vocabulary, but you think about grammar. It's the opposite. It's the opposite. So over the long term, what you should do is think about vocabulary and guess with grammar. That's so wild to me. It's so different to what I thought. I mean, I actually learnt that. The first year as a teacher, I learnt that you should guess with vocabulary, but think about your grammar when you're speaking. And it's the opposite. That's so wild, isn't it? Anyway, thanks for the question, Anawat. Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's an interesting point, Sylvia. But I mean, in Spanish, no verb needs a subject, does it? We have implied subjects, but the actual word itself doesn't. Yeah, I guess it is different with I, though. Anyway, you're the expert. I don't want to argue with you on Spanish. If anyone needs information about Spanish grammar, then you go to Sylvia. Yes, you can, actually, Sylvia. You can say Irene. Yeah. You can. It's weird, for sure. It is weird and doesn't make meaningful sense, but you can say it. How can easy clearly word in English? Sorry, Nurkan, I don't quite understand because you're missing the verb. How can what easy word? How can you say? How can you learn? How can you understand? Which one? And it's the Dan question. Are the following sentences correctly correct? Dan, I think you should join the membership. How long until the meeting starts? Until how long does the meeting start? Until how long? Never since we were kids. Never since we were kids have we had. Never since we were kids. Never since we were kids. Never since we were kids have we had such a fun adventure. How long until the meeting starts? Until how long does the meeting start? 1 and 3 are correct. And number 2 makes sense, but I don't think it's correct. Yeah, because the question should be, until how long am I free? So, because the meeting hasn't started, so it's until how long am I free, not until how long does the meeting start, because that implies that the meeting is starting for that duration of time. So you could say, Dan, to make that correct, number 2, you say something like, until how long will you be visiting the UK? Does that make sense? Until how long? I don't really like this until how long. Until how long? But we say how long until. How long, what duration of time until this happens? That makes sense. No, until how long doesn't make sense because until is asking about a specific time. Until represents a duration itself. So you cannot say until 5 years because then you've said until plus a duration. You need to say until plus a time. Until 5 o'clock. Until 2026. Until next year. So we need until plus a time, and it represents a duration. You can't say until and then a duration. So until plus how long, and how long is the question word representing a duration, that doesn't make sense. So number 2 doesn't make sense. Yeah, we might do it. Can you tell me how I understand English more clearly? Well, Nurkan, that is a long process, okay? And going off what we did today, 1, study the meaning of vocabulary. And 2, listen to English which you can understand a lot. And get positive feedback when you understand it. So that's what you need to do, Nurkan. And there's few ways you can do that, like listening to a podcast you enjoy, talking to someone and having fun with it. But it starts with studying the vocabulary meaning. Yeah, I think you mentioned that, Sylvia. That's fantastic. Of Spanish, is that? Rich, is there any case where we would need to use the passive voice in the perfect continuous tense? Perfect continuous. I've been studying English for 20 years. English has been being studied. Oh. It's been being... No, we don't do it. Yeah. We don't do it, Sleepwalker. It sounds... It's weird. Like something like that, right? It's been being studied for years. Can I instill a love of learning English in my niece? Procedural, declarative. I try to include every time, but I can't see it. Yeah, focus on procedural. I know what. Right? Just play with her. Just be like, I'm gonna go to the park. And then she'll be like, I'll go to the park or something. How old is she? And you go, I'm gonna go to the park. You go, I'm gonna go to the park. And you go, yeah, that's cool. You got it. Oh, let's film it. Let's film it and show your mum. Okay, get a camera. I'm gonna go to the park. Oh, this is great. Let's go show your mum. Look at this. Look, I'm gonna go to the park. Oh, isn't that great? She's speaking English. Positive reinforcement. And practice. But for motor skills and for the rules, the grammar. So you also need the meaning. What does it mean? She doesn't know, right? I'm going to go to the park. So you want to explain that in some way. Or maybe you really do it. Like if you're taking her to the cinema, you can say, hey, we're going to go to the cinema. Say it in English. We're going to go to the cinema. Oh, come on, bit better. We're going to go to the cinema. We're going to go to... She says it, and you go, yeah, we're going to go to the cinema. And then you go to the cinema. So she's got the meaning as well then, and she can think about that. And you can say, hey, what does it mean? I'm going to go to the cinema. What does it mean? Oh, it means... And she will tell you in Thai, for example. So things like that. Things like that. I know what. That positive reinforcement, the fun, and really doing it. You know, do it. Say it. Everybody enjoys pronunciation drills, right? They're fun. I've been taught English, so that is the present perfect simple passive, which, yes, we do use a lot. Yes, I read in the Cambridge Dictionary that natives don't use the passive voice in perfect continuous, but I thought there may be some cases anyway. No, we don't. In perfect continuous, no. We don't. We don't. To be honest, the present perfect continuous itself we do use, but the past perfect continuous actually is very limited as well. So the perfect continuous in general is quite specific because it's just present perfect continuous, really. Present perfect continuous, and it's active, right? Not passive. All right then. Okay, anyone got anything else? It's better to use phrases. Yes. Use phrases. Use advanced words, use phrases. Definitely. It's 100% better. Phrases and advanced words, 100% better. That's the way to go, for sure. Do that. Phrases and advanced words. I'm all about the phrases. I'm all about the advanced words. But you need to learn them. And actually, by the way, Urquhart, there's another really interesting theory which gives us some implications about this. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about it today, but learning phrases and collocations helps with your procedural grammar acquisition. So that's a good way of encouraging your procedural memory to learn the grammar rules, is you learn fixed phrases. For example, instead of learning the passive, learn that as a fixed phrase and use it. Or this is something I'd never thought about before now. You want to blow the mind of an IELTS examiner. This is something I'd never thought about before now. Just learn that as a phrase. Oh, it's a complex sentence and it's got the past perfect, and don't care. Just learn it as a phrase and say it just naturally. This is something I never thought about before now. This is something I'd never thought about before now. This is something I'd never thought about before now. You got it? This is something I'd never thought about before now. Can you say it like funnily? Can you say it like in an English way? Hello. This is something I'd never thought about before now. How about American? Car, man. This is something I'd never thought about before now. This is something I'd never thought about before now. This is something I'd never thought about before now. How about German? This is something I'd never thought about before now. This is something I'd never thought about before now. Well, they don't necessarily, Pachu. I mean, I can speak fast as well. You want to hear it? Let me read something for you. It thus seems likely that language should depend at least partly, if not largely, on the neurobiological systems that existed prior to language. Whether or not those systems have subsequently become further specialized for this domain, either through evolution or development. In this chapter, I focus on the long-term memory systems, since most of the language must be learned, whether or not aspects of this capacity are innately specified. Specifically, we're interested in whether and how two memory systems, declarative and procedural memory, play roles in language. These are arguably the two most important long-term memory systems in the brain in terms of the range of functions and domains which they subserve. The declarative, or DP model, simply posits that these two memory systems play key roles in language in many ways that are analogous to the functioning of these systems in other domains. Not just Americans. Some people say the British speak faster. Collocations, yes. Idioms, not so much. But the elephant in the room is great. You want to learn an idiom? Just learn the elephant in the room. It's the best idiom in English. Yeah, but Pachu, it depends. Like, if you mean New York and California, yeah, they speak fast. But what about Maine and New England and Utah and Massachusetts and Michigan? They speak slow. British. British is better. How can I say American, Urquaz? I'm a British English teacher. Of course I'm going to say British. It depends where they're from, Pachu. When you say East Coast Americans, we think New York and Boston. And of course, people from cities speak fast. But what about New England? That's East Coast and they speak slow because it's not a city. That's cool. All right, everybody, I think it has come to time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope this has been beneficial to you. My name has been Professor Rich. It's my pleasure to bring this to you today. Of course, my Lord and Savior is Jesus Christ, and may he be with me and with you, should you be inclined to open your heart to him. Thank you very much, everybody, and I will, of course, hopefully see you next time. I don't know if that's going to be next week, but it might be. I don't know. Let's find out. We'll see. gets quite close to Christmas next week, and my life gets very complicated. Everyone's life gets very complicated, doesn't it? It is complicated. Life is complicated. But my life is really complicated at the moment, folks. Really complicated. All right. Have a nice weekend, folks. And I'll catch you later.